Hey, fifth graders. We are skipping chapter 3 in your um, textbook, but if you want to read that, you are welcome to. It's just about the different European groups that were in Iowa before it became a part of the United States, like the French, the British, so on and so forth. And it also talks about the Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark's exploration of Iowa. So if you want to read that, you're welcome to, but I just didn't think it was something you absolutely needed to know about Iowa history. So if you want to follow along with me while I read, it's starting on page 44 from the top. This chapter is about the pioneers in Iowa. So I'm just going to start with the reading. In the 19th century, thousands of people left the East to establish new homes in the West. At first, they settled in states like Ohio and Indiana, but by the 1830s, settlers were moving into Iowa. Soon after their arrival, the newcomers wrote letters to friends and relatives back east, telling them about Iowa's fertile soil. Between 1833 and 1870, almost 1 million people came to live in Iowa. By 1870, most of the state had been settled, and farms and small towns had appeared everywhere. The early settlers. Most of the people who settled in Iowa before the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, came from the northeastern United States and the states of Ohio and Indiana. Some Southerners also migrated to Iowa in the 1840s and 1850s, mostly from Kentucky, Virginia, and Missouri. Along with settlers from the Northeast and South, many Europeans immigrated, to Iowa. Immigrants are people born in a different country who moved to the United States. Although more people came from Germany than any other foreign land, people also came from Holland, the British Isles, and the Scandinavian countries. Most immigrants came to Iowa because they knew they could buy good land for little money. And that chart on the next page, everybody, you can see based on the 1870 census where people that lived in Iowa at the time came from. It's pretty interesting to view. Anyways, once people decided to come to Iowa, it took them a long time to get here. In the 1840s and 1850s, people traveled from Ohio and Pennsylvania by covered wagon. Later on, others were able to take the railroad for part of the way. One family bound from Iowa, Hosea and Mary Ann Newton, left their home in Connecticut in 1858. First, they traveled on a stagecoach, then a steamboat, and finally on a railroad to Louisa County, where the railroad ended. For the last leg of the journey, the Newtons hired a man and his team of horses to take them to their new home in Keokuk. Families often walk the last part of the journey. Imagine walking all that way to everybody. Ephraim Fairchild moved to Iowa with his wife and children in 1857, helped by an uncle, Jeremiah Gard, who owned land nearby. The Fairchilds settled on a farm in Jones County. This letter described the journey west from their home in New Jersey to Jones County, Iowa. If you'd like to read that on your own, everybody, it's pretty interesting to read. Just talks about his journey and encountering that Midwestern niceness that you've maybe heard of. We're known for being polite people, fun fact for you all. Okay, so I'm moving on to page 48 at the top. When European immigrants came to the United States, they traveled on either sailing ship or steamships. Families might board a ship in Bristol, England, or Amsterdam, Holland, to make the trip to America. Sometimes it took a boat 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The voyage was so long and difficult that people often became sick. Many immigrants landed in New Orleans, where they boarded steamboats to travel up to the Mississippi River. About 3 weeks later, they arrived in one of Iowa's river cities. People coming to Iowa in the 1800s mostly came in family units. The newcomers would bring along their children and maybe their parents too. Sometimes two brothers and their wives and children came together, building their farm side by side on the Iowa prairie. It was the practice for families to help each other find land and build their homes. Next section, woodland and prairie. When people arrived in Iowa in the 1830s and 1840s, most of them viewed the prairie for the first time. For many, it seemed strange and unpleasant because most of the newcomers came from states where trees were plentiful. In the early 1800s, the northeastern United States had so many trees that it was said that a gray squirrel could jump from tree to tree for 700 miles and never touch the ground. Because of the abundance of timber, people in the Northeast used wood for all their needs. In their log cabins, they burned wood for fuel and for light in the evenings. They ate on wooden tables, rocked their babies in wooden cradles, and served their soup with wooden ladles. Farmers also built fences from wood. These people had developed a woodcraft for their lifestyle. Once settlers arrived in Iowa, however, they could no longer practice woodcraft. In extreme eastern Iowa, the first comers found enough timber to build log cabins and fill their other needs, but those who came next had to travel farther into Iowa to find land. They settled on the prairie, which is covered with tall grass but lacked trees. Like Lieutenant Leah, many of Iowa's new settlers were excited about the beauty of the prairie. They delighted in the wildflowers that bloom through the summer. During June, yellow, white, and pink flowers were everywhere. By July, the wood lilies were in bloom. And in late summer, I'm moving on to the next page, page 50, yellow coneflowers and goldenrod covered the prairie. Throughout the summer, the land was a brilliant carpet of pink, red, purple, yellow, and orange. Not all settlers thought the prairie was inviting. Some were homesick because Iowa looked so different from their homes back east. One woman from New York told her husband that she thought she would die because there were no trees near her new home. Immigrants from the Scandinavian countries felt particularly strange on the prairie. They missed the valleys and tree-covered mountains in their native lands. Once settlers had moved on to the grassland, they had to find substitutes for wood. There were usually enough trees along the rivers and streams to build log cabins, but pioneers had to experiment with different materials for fuel and fencing. In an attempt to build fences, some settlers stacked rocks into walls, others planted hedges and discovered that the fast-growing Osage orange made the thickest fence. For fuel, families sometimes burned dried prairie grass, which they had tied into knots. In 1 hour, 2 children could tie enough hay knots to provide fuel for an entire day. Other families burned corn cobs or cow chips, dried cow manure. How would you like that to light your fire, guys? Just burn some dried up cow manure. Settlers living in southern Iowa soon discovered that coal jutting from the riverbanks and ravines made a good fire. In the 1870s, pioneers began moving into extreme northwest Iowa, where there are almost no trees. This would be more our area, everybody. These families faced the greatest adjustment to the prairie environment. Again, they experimented with different materials using sod, clumps of earth with grass and roots to make homes. Once built, a sod house provided a good warm place to live. When winter winds howled across the prairie, the sod houses stood firm, held solidly in the place by the weight of the dirt itself. In addition to a lack of timber, Iowa's early settlers faced the problem of prairie fires. In the fall, lightning or any spark could start a blaze raging in the dry grass. Prairie fires were frightening because they burned so rapidly. Once a fire was spotted, every man, woman, and child was expected to help beat it out. At night, a prairie fire was a spectacular sight, with flames sometimes rising 30 feet in the air. John and Sarah Kenyon moved to Delaware County, Iowa from Rhode Island in 1856. John and Sarah rented land from her father, Richard Ellis. In this letter, John Kenyon describes their fight to save lives and property and from the approaching fire. And if you want to read that on your own, again, everybody, that is up to you. So I'm moving on to page 52, that next section, surveying and purchasing land. Once families had arrived in Iowa, the first thing they needed to do was to buy land. But before they could do that, the federal government had to survey, measure, and map the land. The survey marks out townships, which were 6 miles square and contained 36 sections. In turn, each section contained 640 acres. An acre is about the size of a football field, and each acre contained 43,560 square feet. The surveys were done by men hired by the federal government, and it took 23 years to survey what is now the state of Iowa. After an area had been surveyed, the government set up a land office where people could buy land. Officials announced a date for a land auction and advertised the sale in nearby newspapers. The day of the sale, an agent auctioned off a few acres at a time. Most settlers bought 80 acres. Since they usually paid $1.25 an acre, that meant they paid $100 for their land. Again, $100 sounds like a very small amount of money for a farm, but in the 1830s and 1840s, many families did not have more than a few dollars. Some families had to work several years before they could save $100. And the image on page 53, everybody, just shows you a diagram of a township, how they set up this surveying of a land. So I'm moving on. Page 54 and 55 is a proclamation given by President Tyler at the time. And it is essentially just saying that he's declaring that the public sales under mentioned land offices in the territory of Iowa at the periods herein after designated to wit, it's basically just his proclamation that this territory can indeed be sold. Because when he was president in 1842, Iowa was not a state yet. It would be a few years later that we became a state. So that's just a neat thing to read if you want. I'm moving on to the next page 56 and 57. This is going to wrap things up. At the end of the auction, a government clerk listed each land sale in a book that was later sent to Washington, D.C. for safekeeping. Each person who bought land received a deed that stated exactly what piece of land had been purchased. Because of this careful system, there were few disagreements over land boundaries. As well as buying land from the government, people could obtain land other ways. The earliest settlers often took advantage of squatters' rights. Squatters claimed land by settling on it and making their boundaries in most parts of Iowa. The surveys were finished before the settlers arrived, but in southeastern Iowa, squatters arrived first. They usually just walked off what they thought would be about 80 acres of land. Sometimes they had walked off the right amount of land, and sometimes they had not. Later, when the surveys were done, squatters had to bring their boundaries in line with those of the official surveyors. Another way to get land was from the railroads. The federal government gave land to railroads to encourage them to buy lines in the central part of the country. The railroads in turn sold most of this land to settlers in order to raise money to build more lines. In Iowa, people bought land from the Illinois Central, the Chicago and Northwestern, the Rock Island, and the Burlington Railroads. People often paid $8 or $10 for an acre of railroad land. Some people coming into Iowa got their land by serving in the Army. Beginning early in our history, the government used land in an interesting way. Because there was little money to pay soldiers, the government sometimes used land as an attraction for joining the Army. Promised that if the men joined the Army, they would receive a piece of land when they finished their term. The government followed this practice for many years. Men serving in the Black Hawk War in 1832 and the Civil War were sometimes paid with 120 acres of land in Iowa. Most of the early settlers came to Iowa from other places in the United States, although some arrived from Europe. The journey was slow and difficult in the 1840s and 1850s. Before railroads were built all the way to Iowa, many families walked the last part of their way. For newcomers, the biggest challenge was learning how to live without plentiful timber. The greatest fear was a prairie fire raging across the dry grasslands. Pioneers came because they wanted cheap land. Some bought it from the railroad, some had army grants, and some squatters just moved in and made a claim. But the greatest number bought their land from the government. Before the federal government sold land in Iowa, this area was surveyed and marked out in each township, squares of 6 miles on each side. Each township was divided into 36 sections, and each section into quarter sections of 160 acres. This careful system prevented quarrels over land boundaries. So that was kind of the big job for our government, was just establishing where these towns began and ended, where one person's land started and where their land ended, so on and so forth. So there's just a few questions on Google Classroom I'd like you to answer now. Have a great Monday and Tuesday, everybody.